Considered to a remarkable extent, the spirituality of people has been overcome by materialism, so that spiritual susceptibility seems to have vanished, divine civilization become decadent, and guidance and knowledge of God no longer remain. All are submerged in the sea of materialism. Although some attend churches and temples of worship and devotion, it is in accordance with the traditions and imitations of their fathers, and not for the investigation of reality. For it is evident that they have not found reality and are not engaged in its adoration. They are holding to certain limitations which have descended to them from their fathers and ancestors. Abdu'l-Bahá.
So today we're really happy to have Dr. Nader Saiedi, and he'll be discussing Abdu'l-Bahā's critique of materialist philosophy. Dr. Nader Saiedi teaches Baha'i studies at UCLA. He was born in Tehran, Iran. He holds a master's degree in economics from Pahlavi University in Shiraz and a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Wisconsin. For over 25 years, he was a professor of sociology at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. In 2013, he became the Taslimi Foundation Professor of Baha'i History and Religion in Iran. His main interests include Babi and Baha'i studies, social theory, Iranian studies, and peace studies. Among his published books are The Birth of Social Theory, Logos and Civilization, and Gate of the Heart. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Saiedi.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. The topic of my discussion, as it was mentioned, is Abdu'l-Bahā's critique of materialistic philosophy. And this is, of course, a vast subject, but in the very limited time that I have, I try to give you an outline of some of the relevant issues, debates related to the subject. Let me mention that the quotation which was read just right now was, in a sense, in a providential fashion, more or less the essence of everything that I want to discuss in the statement of Abdu'l-Bahá, which was read right now. Abdu'l-Bahá was criticizing the dominance of materialistic philosophy and sentiment, estrangement from spiritual nature and reality of human being. But at the same time, in that same discussion, he was criticizing what appears to be religion, what appears to be worship of God, what appears to be a spiritual approach, but in reality, it is nothing but worship of dead traditions and imitation and following of ancestors or society or prejudices of society. So in that same statement, Abdu'l-Bahā's critique of materialism becomes very comprehensive. And that's really the point that I want to emphasize in this discussion. Abdu'l-Bahá is born in 1844. On that same night that Abdu'l-Bahá was born, the Baha'i Faith was born as well. The two founders of the Baha'i Faith, the Bab and Bahá'í, they lived in 19th century. And the declaration of the Bab, inception of this new spiritual movement, took place in that same night in 1844. So it is important to note that that time period is also the time period of the dominance of materialistic philosophy in Western philosophy. Without going into details of that, 1844 is a time that we see materialistic philosophy in varieties of forms becomes really dominant in Western philosophy, social theory, political theory. One of the most important expressions of that, of course, is Nietzsche. Nietzsche is born in that same year, in 1844. And the entire philosophy of Nietzsche argues that there is no God. In his words, God is dead. And for that reason, he concludes that there is no truth and there is no value. So both the idea of truth, that some things are true, some things are false, and so on. And at the same time, the idea of values, I mean, some things are good, some things are bad, and so on. Both of them, according to Nietzsche, are illusions and should be rejected. And in terms of his philosophy, which is called nihilism in varieties of forms, because there is no God, therefore there is no possibility for any truth and for any value. And to a large extent, this becomes much more influential later on in 20th century and right now in 21st century. For example, the schools of thought that we have called postmodernism, cultural relativism, moral relativism, and the like, all of them are based upon the same idea that, that there is no universal truth and there is no value. And so values become related to cultures, and the idea is that no culture is better than another culture. And so good or bad becomes absolutely relative. So good for a society is what the tradition of that society says, because there is no objective good or bad. And therefore, this postmodern ideas, in a sense, unconsciously goes back to the pre-modern idea, namely worship of traditions. Whatever which has existed in the past, whatever which is the status quo, that becomes what is good, namely by rejection of the objective character and universality of values. Then the only basis of values become tradition of a culture, status quo. And that is why they return to tradition. I mean, all different groups, all different cultures, and so on. You see that in 21st century, the idea that we have to go back to our own tradition, to our own past, and so on, becomes so powerful because it's partly, not partly, strongly influenced by this worldview, by this philosophical outlook. So in Nietzsche, what we see is that rejection of God, namely materialistic philosophy, requires the rejection of not only any truth, but also any values. And therefore, that means justification of everything. As Nietzsche says, everything is permitted. And in Nietzsche's philosophy, for instance, he believes that humans are not created equal, and therefore he's opposed to democracy. He thinks that some people are superior in varieties of ways, and they should be the ones who should rule. He has no problem with slavery and praises Greek and Roman culture and social structure, which was based upon slavery and so on. So anyway, this is a very important expression of this materialistic philosophy. But the opposite, in a sense, also takes place. Namely, 1844 not only is the time that Nietzsche and nihilistic philosophy and so on are born, but also 1844 is the time that Marxist philosophy is born. The the Marxian philosophy and his thesis of historical materialism. That is born at the end of 1843 and 1844. And as Marx and Engels, both of them say, they say that after reading Feuerbach's book, The Essence of Christianity, which is a book which argues that there exists no God. They say that after reading that book in 1843, both of them became overnight atheists. And they develop this particular sociology and philosophy, which they call historical materialism, or sometimes dialectical materialism. And the premise, the whole idea of course, is materialism and rejection of spiritual values and ideas and so on. But the consequence of this theory is that since it reduces human beings and society to the material level, from that it concludes that therefore we can scientifically, categorically deduce from reason and science what is good and what is bad. Namely, the theory becomes the idea that we can know absolute truth about society and history. So Marxism presents itself as the science of society and history. We can not only know everything about society, but we can predict everything about society and history. But also we can deduce exactly in a rational fashion, totally we can deduce what is good and what is bad. But this philosophical, and of course, then communism becomes good, and class society, including capitalism, becomes evil. And in this particular worldview, we see therefore that rejection of God and reduction of humans to the materialistic level does not lead to rejection of values, but it leads to affirmation of a dogmatic scientism in which all truth and all values can be absolutely deduced. And of course, the implication of this is that people who would believe in that perspective, then they think that scientifically they know everything. And anybody who disagrees with them or would have a different understanding of the world or a value system, by definition, they become not only ignorant, not only having false ideas, but they become enemies of civilization, enemies of humanity. And they have to be suppressed and they have to be repressed. In other words, although Marxist theory talks about socialism and democracy and so on, but the philosophical premises of that is entirely opposed to both democracy and freedom of thought. In a situation that you can deduce the truth, and the only way to deduce the truth and values is through this science of society and history, then there is no possibility. You know what is good for everybody. And if people disagree with you, that means that they don't know what is good for them. And therefore, it is okay to impose by force what is really good for them. And that is one of the reasons that all communist movements and revolutions, although they have these beautiful slogans of extension of democracy and human rights and freedom and so on, they end up in deification of state, in creation of a totalitarian state, and elimination of all kinds of freedoms and rights. But all this suppression and oppression takes place in the name of freedom, in the name of human rights, in the name of morality, in the name of battle against oppression. Another very important expression of this materialistic philosophy manifests itself just a few years after 1844, namely in 1852, with the publication of the origin of species by Darwin. And so the emergence of Darwinian theory, which is a biological theory, and in principle, there is nothing wrong with that theory as a biological scientific theory. But that theory becomes interpreted in a philosophical way. And so in addition to Darwinism as a scientific empirical theory, which has to be addressed and criticized, accepted, verified through science and empirical methods. In addition to that, a philosophical, metaphysical Darwinism came into existence, which argued that since human beings are product of evolution, therefore we are just an animal, and therefore there exists no God, and there exists no soul, and therefore from that it concludes atheism and materialism. But this philosophical Darwinism, which has nothing to do with the scientific Darwinism, that is a metaphysical, philosophical interpretation, an arbitrary interpretation of Darwinian theory, becomes the basis for another Darwinism. And that Darwinism is called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism becomes extremely powerful in the second half of 20th century. And it comes up with a very different set of ideas. Namely, social Darwinism argues that since there is no God, since there is no soul, since humans are purely a natural animal, like any other animal, therefore, it concludes, the law which should operate at the level of society should be the law which operates at the level of nature. Since the law of nature, operating at the level of nature, is the law of struggle for existence, survival of the fittest. Darwin talked about the struggle for existence. Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest. Because of that, therefore, social Darwinism becomes a theory which says that at the level of society, morality, politics, social relations, political relations, the regulating principle of life must be struggle for existence. That means that according to this theory, war, aggression, colonialism, these are means of progress, that they are all good and necessary for progress of humanity. And therefore, this theory becomes justification of all kinds of evil and oppressions, from racism, because according to this theory in varieties of forms, since there is no soul and humans are product of this materialistic evolution, so different groups of humanity are located at different levels of this evolution, and therefore some are superior to the others and so on. And so racism, patriarchy and sexism, extreme forms of nationalism, colonialism, and so on become justified. And in a sense, science, in the name of science, social Darwinism, the science of Darwinism, in the name of science, a particular set of values are emphasized. And these values are, of course, the values of jungle and return to the jungle. There are other expressions of this materialistic philosophy which appears at the same time, but because of the limitations of time, I won't go into more detail, but these are the dominant philosophical, sociological ideas that emerged around 1844, and they have become dominant increasingly in the world. And you see that even the first half of 19th century, more spiritual types of philosophies like Hegelian dialectic, Hegelian theory, in some ways have some spiritual orientations. But from this time, we see the dominance of these materialistic doctrines. And not only they interpret the world in a way by rejection of God and defining the world as a set of materialistic realities, but also they have very important implications on the concept of values, on what is good or bad, morality, and therefore how we should order society and what is the ideal form of society and so on. When you look at all of these expressions of materialistic philosophy, whether it is in Darwin, in Nietzsche's rejection of any values, which means acceptance and justification of any form of savagery and oppression ultimately, or in the direct form of social Darwinism and its absolute reduction of humans to the level of jungle, even in the form of Marxism, which has a good intention and it wants to create justice, it wants to create equality, but because of its materialistic philosophy, it becomes extremely dogmatic. And the consequence of that is that not only the ideal that it perceives, the solution, which becomes communism, the solution becomes worse than the problem, but also the method of moving towards realization of those values and so on become the method of jungle, becomes the justification of all kinds of violence, censorship, and the like. So what we see right now in the world in varieties of ways are to a large extent products of this denial of God and alienation from our spiritual truth. It is at this time that Baha'i faith appears in the world. And Abdu'l-Bahá is born on that same night. And the entire life of Abdu'l-Bahá, his worldview, his life, his actions are oriented towards a rejection of this form of philosophy, materialistic philosophy, and replacing it with a spiritual orientation. And so for Abdu'l-Bahá, the ultimate source and cause of all problems that we have in the world, anywhere in the world, ultimately goes back to this neglect of our spiritual truth. Baha'u'llah, the ultimate founder of the Baha'i faith, who is the father of Abdu'l-Bahá, in variety of his writings, in a number of, for instance, his hidden words, points out a very beautiful idea. He says God is speaking to humanity in variety of forms, that I have created you noble while you have abased yourself. So God says that the way God has created humanity, the authentic, real reality of human being is that human beings are created noble. Human beings are created, and then he continues, are created out of the essence of knowledge, essence of love, and the like. But human being forgets this spiritual truth of humanity and becomes immersed in a materialistic preoccupations and in selfish orientations. And the consequence of that is that humanity makes itself alienated from its authentic spiritual truth, and therefore becomes the opposite of what the truth of humanity is, namely becomes embodiment of aggression, of selfishness, of prejudice, ignorance, and the like. The history of humanity, from the point of view of the Baha'i faith, to a large extent, is the history of creation of ideologies, of false ideas, in order to justify this estrangement of humanity from its truth. Namely, in varieties of ways, we human beings throughout the history have created these worlds, these artificial worlds, artificial false ideologies and ideas in order to separate us from each other, in order to justify cruelty and oppression, in order to return us to the level of the jungle, to forget our spiritual truth and the spiritual truth of all others, and therefore see each other as beasts and treat each other as beasts, having a beast-like culture. This has been the main function of ideologies, philosophies that humanity has created. Look at the way that we have taken everything and the way we have interpreted them. We have taken the color of skin, for example, and has built an ideology upon that, which has created this worldview dominant in human history, that some people, because of the color of skin, are superior, some people, because of the color of skin, are inferior, and that becomes justification of differences of rights and so on. Look at the ignorance of humanity, which has taken a simple biological difference. Some are masculine, some are feminine, and has taken this biological difference and has built philosophies and ideologies and worldviews upon them, which has created the idea that, for example, women are inferior, are irrational, and so on and so on. Men are this, and therefore particular social rights, particular authorities, and so on should be denied to women, and so on. We have, as human beings, have come together in different groups and have created, for instance, nations, countries. And then we have developed all these philosophies on that basis, which has created justification of prejudice and hatred against other groups, justification of colonialism, justification of war, aggression, imperialism, and the like. All Abdu'l-Bahā's writings, all his discussions, are systematic attempts to destroy all these artificial, false ideologies that humanity has created in order to separate humans from each other, in order to reduce us to the level of jungle, so that we would continue to live in a beast-like culture, to live on the basis of the struggle for existence. Abdu'l-Bahá, on the contrary, argues that because we are a spiritual being, and therefore rejection of the law of jungle, rejection of the materialistic idea, because we are a spiritual being, therefore we are all reflections of God, reflections of divine attributes. And that means that everyone is beautiful and sacred. Therefore, everyone is equal and everyone is endowed with rights. This is a spiritual interpretation of reality. This is a spiritual interpretation of humanity, therefore becomes the basis of the idea that the only regulating principle of the life of humanity should be the law of love, should be the law of right, should be the law of justice. So love, justice, equality, compassion, and so on, peace should be the regulating principle of society. And so Abdu'l-Bahá and the Baha'i faith in general is a call to humanity to forget this forgetfulness of its spiritual reality and to create a new culture, a new civilization, a new order. And in this new order, then the basis of values becomes this spiritual sanctity and sacredness of all beings and all humanity. Abdu'l-Bahā's critique of materialism is not just affirmation of the sacredness of human beings. It is also affirmation of the sacredness of all reality. I wish I had much more time so I could address some of these issues, but in a very, very concise fashion. Abdu'l-Bahá defines all reality with a particular definition. It defines nature, it defines religion, it defines knowledge, he defines love, all of them as necessary relations arising from realities of things. But this definition actually has a background in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, in 18th century philosophy, French philosophy. However, because they wanted to emphasize, they applied it to the level of law in society, and they wanted to say that society is based upon law and it is not arbitrary. So Abdu'l-Bahá agrees with this idea, lawfulness of reality, society, but he extends it to all reality, this concept. But at the same time, he makes a total new conception, which is the exact opposite of the perception of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Abdu'l-Bahá argues that these necessary relations arising from realities of things, these realities of things are not isolated, solid things which have a fixed nature, and therefore out of the nature of this thing and that thing and so on, particular relations, necessary relations emerges. On the contrary, Abdu'l-Bahá says that when you open your eyes and see the reality in a much more careful fashion, you discover that these realities of things is actually the fundamental principle of interdependence and the unity and interconnection of all things to each other. This mutual reciprocity, this thing that everything is the requirement of everything else, this unity of everything, interaction of anything, that is the realities of things, not solid little things that each one of them have particular fixed nature. And therefore, from the point of Abdu'l-Bahá, all reality becomes necessary relations, but these necessary relations are expressions of the fact that all realities are interconnected, are organic, unity, and ultimately expressions and reflections of God. In this particular perspective, Abdu'l-Bahá adds a very other important idea, and that's the idea that he says that although this is a necessary relation, for example, in terms of nature, the laws of nature, but this necessity is not a logical necessity. He says that there are three possibilities about the laws of nature. One is that relations of phenomena to each other are accidental, random. And he says that this cannot be the case because we can predict. We know that when you have water and give heat, at certain points it would evaporize. It happens in a very regular fashion. Therefore, it is not relations of phenomena to each other are not random or not arbitrary. The second option becomes that they are therefore necessary, but a logical necessity. A logical necessity, it means that it has to be in this way and it cannot be in any other way. That it is not possible to even imagine any other alternative. So things are perceived in this particular perspective as having some immutable, constant essences, and therefore this essence requires these particular events and relations. Abdu'l-Bahá rejects this idea, which, by the way, has been a very important aspect of the modern philosophy in the philosophy of David Hume, for instance, in the 18th century. He was one of the first to discover that the laws of causation, he calls them regular sequence, but not necessary, but not logical necessity. They are regular sequence, but it's an empirical sequence. We say that they have this necessity because we see them, we experience them in reality, but not that it has to be that way, that it is logically necessary. So for Abdu'l-Bahá, the reality of nature and relations, neither they are random nor logical necessity. Therefore, Abdu'l-Bahá says there is only a third possibility. And that third possibility, he called it volitional necessity. Namely, the events of nature, the laws of nature, the laws of causation, they have necessity, they have regularity. But the source, foundation of this necessity is a will, is the will of God. God has decided, God has willed that these would be the forms of relations. This would be the forms of necessity in the world. They are not a logical necessity. And since they are not random, therefore the only possibility becomes the will of God, which Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, uses this as a mighty argument for the existence of God. But in addition to that, he is creating a totally different way of looking at the world, a totally different way of looking at nature. Namely, all events of nature becomes miracles. Every event that happens is not a logical necessity, and it's not a random, but it's affirmation of a will. A divine will has decided that this happens in this way. So whatever happens is a miracle of God. Whatever happens is exciting, is beautiful. So Abdu'l-Bahá, in a sense, is inviting us, humanity, to fight against the greatest enemy of our consciousness, namely habituation, habits. Because we have habits, therefore we see the beauty of nature, the glory and the mystery and the miraculous character of all these natural events. But because we become habituated to that, then we forget this miraculous, mysterious, magical character of all reality, of all events of nature. And because of that habituation, then we end up in a mechanistic worldview that we think the world is in this mechanistic worldview and it becomes boring and we see no need for God and we forget God. And then it creates a boredom in our lives and lack of meaning and absurdity and suicide or addiction or other pathological responses of life, self-destructive patterns of life becomes the response to this boring character of reality. We have to fight against this habituation and look at the world as if you are born right now. Look at the world as if it is the first time that we see a seed which is planted within the earth, and there is some water and some light that in a few days after that, a living reality germinates, that a plant comes into existence and so on. And this is an absolute, beautiful, miraculous, mysterious event that the first time that you see these things, of course, the first time you will see the sunset and sunrise or anything really, anything related to our body, for instance, is all so mysterious, so magical, so beautiful, everything. Any problem in my hand, a wound or something like that, in mysterious fashions, a healing process starts and so on. The interconnection of everything to everything, whether it is at the level of organic reality or the system of ecology and nature and so on. In any case, so for Abdu'l-Bahá, when he discusses the reality, and the reality become defined as necessary relations, but this necessity ultimately is a volitional necessity based upon a will, of a divine will. And that means that everything becomes beautiful and miraculous and so on. Everything becomes embodiments of the will of God. Everything is spiritual. And so the message of Abdu'l-Bahá, like the Bab, like Baha'u'llah, the message of Abdu'l-Bahá is that it is not the case, the traditional distinction in religious discourse, that some things are spiritual, but something is material. The spiritual is good, the material, this world is bad, natural. For Abdu'l-Bahá, all reality is spiritual. This nature is spiritual. The essence of everything, every event is spiritual. It's the will of God. Everything is the embodiment of the will of God. Laws of causation, natural events, and so on are this magical, beautiful mystery. Everything is a mystery of God. And of course, in such a world, life is meaningful. Life is beautiful, and action within this world, human beings, and freedom and responsibility, and consciousness of the spiritual nature of things, the spiritual nature of humanity, and so on, binding us to each other, and transcending the realm of nature, transcending the realm of a struggle for existence. That becomes a beautiful pattern journey for humanity. So let me finish in 5 minutes some of the implications of this. For Abdu'l-Bahá, therefore, the time has come that humanity collectively becomes reawakened to the spiritual truth of reality and one's own spiritual truth. And therefore, to move towards our truth, the spiritual orientation. And that means, according to Abdu'l-Bahá, realization of true freedom. Abdu'l-Bahá has a new definition of freedom, a new philosophy of freedom, has no precedence before. And his basic point is that the ultimate freedom for humanity is emancipation of humans from the law of jungle, emancipation of humans from the law of nature, emancipation of humans from the law of struggle for existence. And when we discover the spiritual truth of reality, the spiritual truth of humanity, and we understand that the regulating principle of society, of human behavior, should be the principle of love and solidarity and peace, and not a struggle for existence, then we see all humanity as one. And therefore, the Baha'i supreme principle, which is oneness of humanity and universal peace, becomes the logical requirements of this event. But not only Abdu'l-Bahá gives this unique definition and theory of freedom, namely emancipation from the law of struggle for existence, he also goes one step further and argues that the way that the law of struggle for existence manifests itself within the realm of human society is through prejudice. Extremely important. For Abdu'l-Bahá, the way that we live our life in accordance with the law of jungle, the way that we humans live in accordance with the law of struggle for existence, is to live in accordance with varieties of prejudices. What is prejudice? Prejudice, according to Abdu'l-Bahá, is that we reduce our identity to a particular group, which means that all others become either strangers or enemies. And this, of course, justifies a double standard morality, namely being nice and good to my group is moral, and being cruel to others also becomes moral. And therefore, this particular idea, this prejudice in varieties of ways, becomes increasingly a justification of not only alienation of humans from each other and creation of these walls against each other, but also justification of all kinds of oppression and injustice against varieties of groups. And therefore, wars and exploitations and patriarchy and racism and religious bigotry and colonialism and slavery, all these things become justified. Not only justified, they become virtues. They become morals in this particular point of view. So for Abdu'l-Bahá, the spiritual reality of humanity can be safeguarded through abolition and elimination and fights against all prejudices. We have to identify ourselves as a member of human race, and not only that, as a spiritual being, a mirror of God. And in that sense, then there is no stranger, there is no enemy. And then consultation and democracy and equal rights and peace, that should be mutual love, that should be the basis of decision-making for society. If you allow me, I read for you two statements of Abdu'l-Bahá, which mention these two ideas that I shared with you, namely his new theory of freedom and his idea that struggle for existence can be eliminated through rejection of prejudice, and conversely, prejudices, all kinds, whether it is religious prejudice, whether it is nationalistic prejudice, whether it is racial, all kinds of prejudices are reductions of humans to the level of jungle. And with that, I've finished this short discussion. Abdu'l-Bahá says, and among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is man's freedom, that through the ideal power, he should be free and emancipated from the captivity of the world of nature. For as long as man is captive to nature, he is a ferocious animal, as the struggle for existence is one of the exigencies of the world of nature. This matter of the struggle for existence is the fountainhead of all calamities and is the supreme affliction. In another statement of him, which was a lecture that he gave in the United States in 1912, he says, in every period, war has been waged in one country or another, and that war was due to either religious prejudice, racial prejudice, political prejudice, or patriotic prejudice. It has therefore been ascertained and proved that all prejudices are destructive of the human edifice. As long as these prejudices persist, the struggle for existence must remain dominant, and bloodthirstiness and rapacity continue. Therefore, even as was the case in the past, the world of humanity cannot be saved from the darkness of nature and cannot attain illumination except through the abandonment of prejudices and the acquisition of the morals of the kingdom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saiedi. We really appreciate your talk. It was very interesting. And so we have time for questions now. So if anyone has questions, you can put it in the chat. Okay, the first question is, would what you kindly shared with us somehow relate to the fact that human knowledge is of two kinds? One is the knowledge acquired through the senses, sensible knowledge. The knowledge of intelligible things, that is, it consists of intelligible realities which have no outward form or place and which are not sensible. Therefore, how would the distinction offered by the beloved master complement the above?
The question of knowledge, of course, is one of the most important elements in this whole discussion of philosophy of materialism in varieties of ways. As I mentioned, a very important implication of varieties of materialistic philosophies was either that there is no truth and therefore knowledge becomes completely negated in Nietzsche, or that since humans are purely an objective material entity, therefore human beings and society can be completely, absolutely known. And the way to know that, of course, is the way that is supposed to be science. And so the social, political, religious, spiritual ideas and so on are or reduced to a particular set of the so-called scientific ideas, whether this was social Darwinism, which deduces from the idea that we are a member of jungle, therefore we have to live in accordance with that, or the Marxist theory that through a particular philosophical, sociological idea, it assumes that it can know and discover everything and so on. One of the very important points in the Baha'i philosophy and in the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá is actually the what he calls the sources and criteria of knowledge. And in variety of his writings, he distinguishes sometimes between the senses, knowledge based upon sensory perception, which corresponds to what was mentioned as one of the types of knowledge in the question. And so varieties of forms of empiricism become the only basis of knowledge. The other ones become intellect. And therefore, the idea is that through reason, not sense perception, we can discover the truth. And this becomes varieties of rationalism. And another one becomes the varieties of traditionalism, including religious traditionalism, which argues that from the appearance of particular texts, because this text is from God, therefore the clerics can tell us, the priests can tell us what is true and what is false. So from appearance of the text, religious texts, we can deduce what is true, what is false. Abdu'l-Bahá argues that all these criteria are valid. Sense perception and empiricism is extremely important. If you have paid attention to my discussion of the laws of nature, you saw that that necessity can be ascertained only through experience, because it is not a logical necessity. It cannot be deduced from intellect. Only intellect based upon experience can create science. Experience becomes absolutely necessary for development of knowledge. And the same is true with intellect. And the same is true with a spiritual truth, with moral truth. When we go beyond the appearances and we try to understand the spiritual truth, the truth of reality. And what is the truth of reality? The truth of reality is that everything is interconnected and everything is reflection of God, and therefore everything is beautiful and sacred. That form of knowledge, the source of that is the spiritual revelation and divine truth, which is our ultimate truth as well. And so for Abdu'l-Bahá, this means that at the same time, all these three are incomplete. That by itself, none of them can give us adequate knowledge. Sense perception can, if it is divested from reason, if it is divested from spiritual truth and so on, can lead us completely to false perspectives. Intellect, if it is divorced from experience and divorced from spiritual truth, leads us astray. Look at, for instance, Greek philosophy. The Greek philosophy emphasizes reason, but this is a reason which is not assisted by experience. And therefore, it could not really go much. But knowledge based upon the text of the revelation of God, according to Abdu'l-Bahá, that is necessary for for attainment of truth, but is not enough. So what is the ultimate truth? Ultimate truth can be accessed through the unity of these three. And in the unity of these three methods, we realize that even at the level of religion and spiritual text, the truth of the text is not the appearance of the text, but the living spirit of that text. That is the true revelation of God. The problem with clerics of the world is that they forget the living character of the word of God and the spiritual meaning of divine revelation. And therefore, in a static way, they become linked to the appearance of the text and reduce reality and truth and values to that appearance. And therefore, instead of religion becoming an instrument for love and progress, religion becomes another form of reduction of humans to the level of nature, to the level of jungle. Actually, this was one of the most important things that I wanted to say. And that's why at the beginning, I said that that statement of Abdu'l-Bahá, which was read in the beginning, captures everything that I want to say. Because for Abdu'l-Bahá, it's not just the West and its materialism that has forgotten God. And therefore, the dominance of the law of jungle becomes increasingly a reality. Also in the East, also among the people who constantly they are speaking of God, speaking of religion, that they engage in fasting and prayers and so on. In these situations, because they forget the living, dynamic character of the will of God and the divine spiritual revelation, and they divorce a particular set of texts and appearance and expressions of that revelation from that living reality of revelations, the consequence of that is that by destroying religion and turning that into a static dead entity and understanding religion in terms of this appearance of these particular texts and laws, then the whole worldview becomes justification of varieties of forms of hatred. They become they are the ones who justify varieties of forms of slavery. They are the ones who have justified varieties of forms of patriarchy and oppression of women. They are the ones who have defended and justified in varieties of ways oppression against non-believers. And in varieties of situations, wars, of colonialism, plundering other countries, other places in the name of religion. Because my religion is superior, therefore I have the right to go and conquer the world and exploit the world, and the whole world should be subject to our will because truth is with me. All these and other forms of expressions of that, we see that, for example, right now in Iran, we have a theocracy in which politics has become expression of the worldview of the clerics. But this whole worldview, although it uses the word God and religion and so on very much, although it pretends to be Islamic, but in reality is the enemy of Islam, is the enemy of all religion. Because what it does is to justify a materialistic worldview, namely reduction of humans to the level of jungle, and therefore justification of the struggle for existence, justifications of varieties of prejudice, justification of varieties of oppression. So whether it is in the Eastern form or the Western form, whether it is in the name of God or in the name of atheism, we have to be on guard against this reduction of humans to the level of jungle. That is atheism, that is materialism. And Abdu'l-Bahá, Baha'u'llah, Baha'i Faith, therefore, invites humanity to become a spiritual. But this spiritual is not the dead appearance of a particular text, religious text, but the living spirit, dynamic spirit of that text, which is the reflection of God, which is the truth of all reality. And in that sense, whether it is our experience, whether it is our reason, whether it is our spiritual intuition and nature, within the unity of these things, we can get in touch with the truth of reality and the truth of ourselves.
Thank you so much for explaining that. So the next question is, does empirical material science need to be balanced with spiritual metaphorical science?
Well, in fact, the science and spiritual truth are inseparable from each other. Namely, as I mentioned in the discussion of Abdu'l-Bahá, all reality, all nature, ultimately are embodiments of the will of God. And so a true scientific understanding of the world, understanding of nature, understanding of human beings, ultimately also becomes confirmation of this mysterious spiritual nature of all reality. But at the same time, science and spiritual truth have different methods, and therefore they are distinct from each other. And this is one of the very important issues that Abdu'l-Bahá has emphasized. Abdu'l-Bahá says that science and religion or spiritual truth are like two wings of a bird. And a bird cannot fly, cannot soar to heaven, cannot progress with only one bird, with only one wing, which would be the wing of science, empirical science, or the wing of a spiritual religious truth. Both of them have to be strong, and both of them should work together, but at the same time, they are distinct. So one wing cannot replace the other wing. They are two different wings. They are separate from each other, but at the same time, they are harmonious with each other. And both of them ultimately affirm one and the same truth. In the truth of science, you see that, for example, in physics, the most illumined minds of the greatest genius of physics, people like, for example, Einstein and so on, they ended up ultimately to this view of nature and reality, which is mysterious, which is mystery. And therefore, that became a confirmation of a spiritual outlook for them. It's only when you have very little science, when you know very little, that you become arrogant, that you become so sure that you know everything, and therefore you know there is no God. I have no problem with a person who would be agnostic, who would say that, I don't know, maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. But a person who is sure that there exists no God, when looking at every little thing in this nature, in this world, shows this mysterious, magical, wonderful character of life. It seems to me a very strange idea. But as I mentioned, I believe the source of materialistic atheistic philosophy in the world right now, because particularly in the Western world, materialistic philosophy has become dominant. And the more you engage in culture, you go to the universities and so on, the more materialistic atheistic philosophy is dominant. In fact, universities are a place of, to a large extent, brainwashing of people into a materialistic worldview and philosophy. But the ultimate source of that, in my judgment, is that habituation that I mentioned. The fact that we allow ourselves to become used to the glory of the mysterious, magical, miraculous, wonderful character of all reality. And therefore, in this dead mechanical world, then of course it is easy not to seek any God. The greatest sociologist who has ever lived, his name is Max Weber, a German sociologist. He very much understood the trend of the modern world. And he said that the modern world is characterized with what he calls disenchantment of the world. He says that because the modern world, through science and so on, has established particular regularities among things, increasingly it has rejected, it has exiled God, ghosts, and so on from its worldview. And the consequence of that is that the world has become disenchanted. It has lost its magical character. And therefore, the world has ended up in a mechanistic worldview. And he argues that this, of course, means loss of meaning in the world. And therefore, he says that either humanity becomes so bored and become destructive, or it has to create false meanings and create some sort of meaning in an artificial fashion. And he argues that worship of power, of authorities, of dictators, of despotism, and so on, like in Nazi Germany, or worship of particular political figures or particular religious figures, and so on. Through this, we learn to have meaning by eliminating of ourselves and our freedom and submitting to the will of a leader. Or he, in a very perceptive fashion, he says that eroticism, he predicts that eroticism becomes increasingly dominant in the culture of the world, because he says in eroticism, in a momentary fashion, one have a sense of transcendence of the self and a sense of meaning, union with another. And therefore it creates a sense of meaning and life becomes possible. But because it is a momentary one, therefore it has to be repeated again and again. It has to become an obsession. And therefore he says that eroticism, this obsession with sexuality and eroticism and so on, he predicts would be one of the substitutes for God, substitutes for meanings and so on. I look at American society right now and many other parts of the world, I see that politics has become the new religion, the new substitute for God. And like a very fanatical, priestly-like religion, which justifies hatred and prejudice, politics also have become the art of teaching us to learn that hating others is virtue. These are all different expressions of the fact that with elimination of God and spiritual truth and so on, we would end up in a world in which love, peace, justice, and so on have no place.
Thank you so much. The next question is, you reference Nietzsche and Darwin. Isn't it true that they both believed in some kind of higher power, but not what's represented through religion?
Well, Nietzsche does not believe in God at all, absolutely. I mean, the entire writings of Nietzsche is rejection of religion, rejection of God, and so on. But in a sense, as I was just saying right now, what Max Weber said, that it is really impossible to reject God, because the moment that you reject God, everything becomes senseless, and therefore you have to fabricate a God. You have to create substitutes for God. And this actually is understood and discussed by Nietzsche himself. Nietzsche himself criticizes the philosophy of the Enlightenment as well as the communistic worldview. And he says that both of them are two new forms of religion, namely new forms of worship of an absolute. He says the reason in the Enlightenment is that, and absolute equality in communism, he says, is the new God. And he rejects both of them because he's rejecting God, and therefore he's rejecting substitutes for God as well. But it's interesting that, and the question which was asked, so in this sense is accurate, that he also replaces another substitute for God. In his discussion, the ultimate good and reality is manifested in this Uberman, in this Superman, and that is where the ultimate truth and value reside. But the value here is the excellence of power, which is not restricted by anything. So it's beyond good and evil, because there is no good and there is no evil. And so for him, the movement of culture and society towards the realization of this Superman, what he calls the emergence of strong nihilism. He says, right now, we have discovered that the reason is inadequate. There is no truth, but that has given us depression. And so he says that this is weak nihilism, but he says this is transition to the strong nihilism, which becomes the view of Nietzsche himself. And that becomes the emergence of a culture in which absolute excellence becomes possible. And that is Uberman. The way he discusses this Superman is, again, very religious. And you know, like anybody else, Nietzsche is a great genius. A number of things that he has said are so perceptive. I haven't discussed those things of perceptive things that he has discussed. But even in his own theory of the history of humanity, his discussion of Apollonian culture and Dionysian culture in order to understand history of the West, these are totally in contradiction with his own ideas of absolute rejection of truth, and that everything is fragmented and there is no really truth and so on. But he himself creates this pattern in history and so on. There is movement and the like. So even Nietzsche, who rejects all values and all truth and so on, cannot remain at that level and is forced to create substitutes and so on.
Thank you. What is your prognosis for Baha'i studies as a field of study in the future?
I believe that the Baha'i faith is in a turning point, in a situation of transition. The Baha'i faith is not just a spiritual doctrine which comes and affirms a set of beliefs like unity of God and the like. On the contrary, Baha'i faith is a worldview, is a spiritual worldview which wants to transform the world, which wants to change the structure of society and culture. Institutions of the society have to change. And so oneness of humanity and universal peace are not just slogans for the Baha'i faith. They are the ultimate goals of the Baha'i faith, which requires creation of a new order, a new spiritual global order in the world. So for Baha'u'llah, for Abdu'l-Bahá, the time has come that we destroy all these walls and create a culture and a set of institutions based upon unity in diversity. Diversity is beautiful, provided that it becomes the occasion for unity. A diversity which becomes the occasion of hatred, mutual alienation, exploitation, has to be rejected. This is one of the main differences of Baha'i faith and Abdu'l-Bahá with the current postmodern ideas. They celebrate all diversity, and they reject really the possibility of any unity. But they don't realize that at the same time that they are saying this thing, that all diversities are good, they are contradicting themselves, because that same person would also engage in criticism of racism, would also engage in criticism of sexism, also engage in criticism of colonialism. But if colonialism should be rejected, if racism should be rejected, that means that not all ideas, all cultures, and so on are equally good. Diversity is beautiful, has to be affirmed, but a diversity which is based upon this spiritual recognition of the sacredness and unity and equality of all beings, of all human beings. And therefore, diversity for Baha'i faith becomes occasion for beauty, but also occasion for communication, not alienation, not estrangement, not hatred, but communication, mingling with each other, knowing each other, rejection of prejudice, and so on. And so the example that Abdu'l-Bahá gives, the metaphor that he gives, he says that humanity is like a garden. The garden is most beautiful when there are different flowers, different trees with different shapes, colors, fragrances, and so on. That diversity makes it beautiful. If it is only one type of color, one type of fragrance, one form of plant, and so on, is not as beautiful. So this diversity is beautiful. But this diversity is beautiful because it's not diversity of destruction. It's not diversity of hatred. And so all ideas, all forms of prejudice, which justify whether it is racism or colonialism or religious bigotry or hating others because they have different ideas and so on. Political hatred, which is so widespread right now, unfortunately, in the world. All these forms of diversity are not diversity, they are conflicts and animosity. So because the Baha'i faith wants to change the world and create a new world, for that reason, Baha'i faith is not purely a matter of scholastic scholarship. But at the same time, to create a new world should be based upon consciousness of a spiritual truth. And therefore, up to this moment, I believe that the ultimate concern of the Baha'i intellectuals and Baha'i scholarship and so on has been mostly on creation of the basic requirements of the emergence of this new order and development of the institutions, including administrative order of the Baha'i faith, so that it can affect the world. But I believe that gradually we also would complement this stage, mostly of practice and action, with a deeper understanding and investigation of the sacred Baha'i writings. And as Shoghi Effendi has always said, the administrative structure order of the Baha'i faith are means, not ends, means for affirmation of a spiritual truth. And so my guess is that we have, because of this historical order, we are experiencing a situation that my guess is that more intimate emphasis on deep study of spiritual texts and so on become much more relevant. And the Baha'i Faith has no priests. This is one of the distinguishing features of the Baha'i Faith, because we are all mirrors of God. So for Baha'u'llah, we all can think independently. And so he rejects the possibility of either political despotism that others would decide for us, or religious despotism that the priests and the like would decide for us what is the will of God. We all have to study and become scholars independently of the sacred writings of God. And I think that, but never just as scholars. It's not a scholastic, it's discovery of the spiritual truth in order to transform the world.
Got it. Thank you. Well, it looks like that's all the time we have. So thank you so much again to Dr. Saiedi. We really appreciated your talk. We learned a lot. We appreciate your time today.
I'm very happy that I was invited and I could share some of these ideas with people who are my friends, whether I know them or not. But thanks for the invitation.
Of course. And if anyone would like to be on our mailing list to get the recording of this talk and to find out about future talks, I've put the link to our contact form in the chat. And next week, our speaker will be Mr. Jack McLean, and his topic will be Shoghi Effendi's role in the creation of the modern Baha'i faith. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.